I'm Francis, 68 years old, and this trip is for family only, my son said. He deleted my name and gave my seat to his wife's friend. At the gate, my daughter-in-law smirked. Go home. Even my son looked away until the pilot turned to me and said, Welcome aboard, owner. Before I continue my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more stories about betrayal, dignity, and reclaiming your life. Trust me, what happened next will show you exactly why it's never too late to take back everything. I stood gripping the handle of my suitcase while Brian scrolled on his phone, and Vanessa whispered something to Amber, who glanced at me with a smugness that made my stomach turn as the airline staff processed her boarding pass, which had my name printed on it just hours earlier, when I checked online believing I was part of their plans for once. I had spent days believing I was included because Brian called me weeks ago saying they wanted me there, and I clung to that phone call like a lifeline as I baked his favorite lemon cake and told Juana, my only friend, that maybe Vanessa was finally softening and maybe my son remembered I was more than just a woman who folded their laundry and watered their plants for free. I gave up my doctor's appointment and canceled my only planned lunch with Juana so I could help Vanessa shop for summer clothes for the trip, where I now realized I had never been truly invited because she spent the entire time talking about how Amber deserved a break after helping her organize charity events, as if I was invisible standing beside them carrying her shopping bags without complaint. Brian said nothing when Vanessa told me not to pack too many shoes because space would be tight and Amber might bring extra luggage, which confused me at the time, but now made perfect sense as I stood at the airport gate holding a suitcase full of new clothes I bought with my last savings, thinking they would be proud to see me looking elegant and respectable instead of frumpy, like Vanessa once described me to her friends over brunch. They never asked if I could afford new clothes for the trip, but when I bought a coral dress, Vanessa casually mentioned how bright colors were not flattering on older women and suggested I return it and buy something age-appropriate, which I ignored because for once I wanted to feel pretty and valued, and I believed this trip would change how they treated me. The night before the flight, I stayed up ironing every item in my bag and placing small wrapped gifts for each of them between layers of clothes because I wanted to surprise them with thoughtful tokens and prove I could still contribute to their happiness, even though they never once surprised me with a birthday cake or even a phone call on Mother's Day since Walter died. They let me scrub their kitchen floors after family dinners and never offer to help or even say thank you, yet they always invited Vanessa's mother to sit at the head of the table during holidays while I was seated near the children, or sometimes not at all because Vanessa said the dining space was tight and someone had to give up their seat, and somehow it was always me. I signed over my house to Brian after Walter's funeral thinking it would give me security and a permanent place in their lives, but Vanessa later suggested I consider moving into their basement suite because they needed the main house for their expanding family, and I nodded weakly even though it felt like they were asking me to shrink into nothingness for their convenience. When Vanessa's plants died one summer, she blamed me for not watering them properly while they were away, even though I stayed in that house every single day taking care of everything from cleaning bathrooms to picking up their mail and feeding their pets, yet she still complained that I forgot her precious ferns, which made her feel justified in telling Brian to keep me out of planning their next vacation. They borrowed money from me for a second car and never repaid it, yet Vanessa criticized me for taking the bus to appointments, saying I should be more independent and not rely on them so much, which stung because every penny I had went to keeping their lives smooth and their children cared for so they could travel without worry. At the gate, I remembered how I asked if I should bring my passport, and Brian said, "Of course, Mom, your family," and I replayed that moment over and over while watching Amber hand her passport to the agent and laugh with Vanessa, who didn't bother glancing at me as if I had already ceased to exist in their world. The flight was announced, and I waited for Brian to turn and say it was a mistake, but he just stared at his phone while Amber boarded with my ticket, and Vanessa adjusted her sunglasses like nothing had happened, and I felt a cold realization settle over me that I was not part of their family, but part of their unpaid staff to be used and dismissed at their convenience. They told me to go home and make sure the house was clean when they returned, and to remember to water the balcony plants and check their mail because Amber would not have time to do it now that she was joining them on the trip I had once dreamed of, and I understood in that instant that they saw me not as a mother or grandmother, but as an old woman whose only value was in servitude. I turned away from the gate, dragging my suitcase behind me, and I felt something break inside me, not from sadness or anger, but from the quiet clarity of knowing I would never again allow anyone to treat me as disposable, and I decided in that moment that this was the last time I would ever be sent home like a hired hand unworthy of sitting at their table. For 3 weeks before the airport betrayal, I woke up early every morning planning my days around their schedules because Vanessa said they needed me to babysit while they prepared for the trip, and I canceled my only weekly coffee with Juana to make sure their children were fed, bathed, and entertained from morning until night without a word of thanks or acknowledgement from either of them. I went through my small savings account over and over, wondering how much I could spend on new clothes without leaving myself short for groceries, and I walked from store to store comparing prices to find dresses and shoes that would make me look respectable enough not to embarrass them when we traveled together, because Vanessa had once laughed that my old cardigans looked like they belonged to someone's grandmother, not a modern woman. Each time I returned home with a shopping bag, Vanessa would comment that I shouldn't spend too much since the trip itself would be exhausting for someone my age, and she suggested I pack light in case they needed extra room for Amber's luggage, which made no sense to me at the time, but I ignored the unease it stirred because Brian had assured me this was a family trip, and I didn't want to believe otherwise. They invited Vanessa's mother to join us for dinner the week before departure and seated her at the head of the table, praising her advice about their children's schooling, while I served plates from the kitchen and ate standing at the counter because there wasn't enough room at the table and no one suggested pulling up another chair for me. When I mentioned I had arranged for someone to water my few potted plants during the trip, Vanessa gave me a list of additional chores to complete before we left, including cleaning their guest room for Amber, who was staying over the night before departure, and washing their laundry, because she said it would be easier for her to pack if everything was folded and ready. I watched them order expensive luggage online while I dug out my old suitcase and polished it until it looked new because I didn't want Vanessa to roll her eyes and call it embarrassing like she had done with my purse once when a handle broke and I stitched it back together instead of buying a new one. They asked me to run errands every other day, picking up travel-sized toiletries and snacks, while Vanessa worked late at her charity events and Brian attended meetings, and neither offered to reimburse me, though I saw receipts for spa treatments and luxury dinners left on the kitchen counter without concern for their cost. Amber started showing up more often, helping Vanessa plan excursions for the trip, and laughing in their living room late into the night while I washed dishes quietly and overheard Vanessa saying Amber deserved the vacation because of all her hard work, and that's when I realized they had never spoken about me like that despite everything I had done for their household. I stayed up past midnight sewing a loose button on one of Brian's shirts because I didn't want him to look unkempt on the trip, and I ironed Vanessa's dresses after she left them crumpled on the guest bed. But when I mentioned I had packed my own things, Vanessa frowned and said I should check with her about the itinerary since some activities might not suit me, which made me feel like an afterthought in a trip I had been led to believe was planned for all of us. They ordered custom luggage tags with their names and even one for Amber, but none for me, and I only realized this when the package arrived and Vanessa handed me the box to discard as if I wasn't meant to see the contents, and I quietly placed it in the recycling without saying a word because I didn't want to seem ungrateful or suspicious. I overheard Amber thanking Vanessa for including her on the trip during a phone call, and Vanessa laughed, saying it would be so much more fun this way, while I stood frozen in the hallway holding Brian's dry cleaning and telling myself I must have misunderstood, because surely they would not replace me without even telling me to my face. The night before departure, Vanessa reminded me to leave my house key with her in case they needed anything, and she said I shouldn't bother cooking dinner that evening because they were ordering in with Amber to finalize plans, and I realized I had spent 3 weeks preparing meals, packing snacks, and reorganizing their pantry for a trip that would not include me. I noticed Brian avoided me more as the trip approached, spending long hours at his office and answering my questions with one-word replies as if I was already an inconvenience, and I forced a smile each time because I didn't want to believe my own son could be planning to exclude me from something he had invited me to with such warmth weeks earlier. Every night, I laid out my coral dress on the bed, imagining how proud Brian would be to see me looking elegant and refined in family photos. But now I understand Vanessa had already decided I would not be in any photos, and Amber would take my place smiling next to my son while I stayed behind watering their plants and dusting their furniture. I woke up the morning after the airport betrayal with the coral dress still folded in my suitcase, and I stared at it knowing I had bought it to please people who had already decided I was no longer worth a seat beside them, and I took it out carefully not because I wanted to wear it for them, but because I needed to see with my own eyes that I still existed beyond their dismissals and commands. I placed the dress over my chair as I checked my phone to find dozens of missed calls and messages from Brian and Vanessa, alternating between weak apologies and blunt reminders about watering their plants and making sure the house was tidy for their return, as if I were a paid cleaner instead of the woman who gave birth to Brian and spent decades putting his needs before my own dreams and health. I read Vanessa's message telling me not to feel bad because the trip would have been too demanding for someone my age, and I remembered how she once told her friends I was lucky to live in a house rent-free after I signed it over to Brian, believing he would protect me, when in truth they had turned me into their unpaid housekeeper with no say over my own home. I looked at the list Vanessa left stuck to my fridge with tasks like grocery shopping, dusting, washing linens, and preparing their favorite soup for the day they returned, and I tore it down slowly, not out of anger, but with a calm decision that I would never again be ordered around in a house I once owned outright before they convinced me it would be easier to let them handle the bills and renovations. I had ignored the small shoebox at the back of my closet for years, believing it only contained old tax documents, but something told me to pull it out now because I could not live another day being treated like furniture in my son's life, and I opened it with shaking hands to find an envelope addressed to me in Walter's handwriting and several folded documents I could not immediately understand. The letter told me Walter had kept something hidden because he wanted me to live without stress, and that I needed to go to the bank with the documents if I ever felt alone or forgotten, and I felt the words burning in my chest because I had spent years rationing food and wearing second-hand clothes, believing I was poor while my late husband had left me with wealth I never even knew existed. I found statements showing ownership of Company A under my name dated shortly before Walter's death, and I sat there realizing I had allowed Brian to handle my finances all this time while Vanessa controlled how much I could spend on groceries and how often I could visit friends, because she claimed we needed to be frugal while they flew first class and bought designer handbags. I called the bank using the number on one of the documents, and after several verifications they confirmed I was listed as the sole owner of a large account connected to Company A, and I felt a cold wave of clarity as I thanked the banker and hung up, knowing I had been living like a servant in my own family while I was in fact the owner of assets they probably dreamed of accessing without ever suspecting they belonged to me. I stood in the kitchen holding the envelope and thought of all the times Vanessa handed me grocery receipts expecting repayment from my widow's pension, and how Brian once said I didn't need my own account because he and Vanessa would make sure I had everything I needed, which in reality meant I had to ask for permission to buy a new pair of shoes or a birthday gift for my only grandchild. For years, I accepted Vanessa speaking to me like I was hired help in front of guests, and I stayed silent when she told me I should be grateful for a small room in their home, because at least I wasn't alone. But now I saw her words for what they were: calculated humiliations designed to keep me compliant and small so they could continue benefiting from my unpaid labor and unconditional support. I opened my phone again and read the most recent message from Brian reminding me to check the mailbox daily, and it struck me that even in his weak apology, he could not bring himself to acknowledge the depth of what they had done, or how they had stripped me of dignity in front of strangers at the airport while handing my seat to a woman who had no right to take my place. I scrolled further to see Vanessa's cheerful posts from the trip already appearing online, with photos of her and Amber laughing by the pool while Brian held drinks in the background, and I realized they had not only replaced me physically, but emotionally, as they celebrated milestones I had been excluded from without hesitation or remorse. I deleted their list of tasks from my phone and started making calls to arrange meetings with the people listed in Walter's documents because I would no longer sit in that house waiting for them to return and tell me where I belonged in their lives, since it was clear I no longer belonged anywhere they considered worth sharing. I booked an appointment with the CEO of Company A using the contact provided in the folder, and I felt no guilt as I ignored yet another call from Brian because I now understood the only reason they might want to talk was fear of what I had discovered, not love or regret over how they had treated me. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of direction not tied to pleasing them or earning crumbs of attention, and I decided I would not tell them about the shoebox or the letter until I was ready because they had taken enough from me, and I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me as weak or desperate again. I arrived at the offices of Company A still wearing the coral dress I had intended for the family trip because I wanted every decision from now on to remind me that I was no longer the woman who stood at the airport gate holding her suitcase like a discarded servant waiting for crumbs of kindness from people who had already replaced her with someone younger and louder and more convenient for their plans. The receptionist checked the documents I carried, and within minutes I was ushered into a private meeting room where the CEO greeted me with a handshake full of respect I had not felt in years, and as he began explaining the company's operations, I realized the empire Walter had quietly built was not only intact, but thriving with routes across the continent and assets that made me one of the wealthiest women in the region. Without my knowledge, I listened to detailed accounts of annual profits contracts with luxury service providers and partnerships I had never imagined while I had been rationing tea bags at home and patching old sweaters to avoid asking Brian for grocery money because Vanessa had once sighed loudly when I requested funds for a doctor's visit, claiming I needed to be less dependent and more resourceful in my old age. The CEO handed me an account summary showing figures I could not comprehend at first, and I felt my pulse steady as I understood Walter had left me control over everything while Brian and Vanessa operated under the illusion that I was a powerless old woman waiting for their permission to exist in my own life. I asked for details about current flights and discovered Brian, Vanessa, and Amber were traveling on one of my aircraft at that very moment, seated comfortably in a cabin funded by my company, while I sat in silence at their command, denied the simple dignity of a family trip because they had deemed me unworthy of the space I had unknowingly paid for. I instructed the CEO to contact the captain of that flight with a message stating the owner of Company A wished to extend personal greetings to all passengers, and I requested the announcement include my full name spoken clearly over the intercom because I wanted Brian and Vanessa to understand the magnitude of their betrayal, not through confrontation, but through public revelation that would leave no room for excuses or denials. As the CEO made the call, I imagined the moment my son would hear my name echo through the cabin and realize the mother he had humiliated and erased was the reason he and his wife were sipping champagne at 30,000 feet with their chosen companion seated, where I should have been if they had valued even a fraction of what I had sacrificed for them over decades. The captain confirmed the message would be delivered with full ceremony, and I sat back in the chair feeling the weight of years lift slightly because I was no longer the voiceless figure handing over house keys and grocery lists. I was a woman who owned the very air they breathed in their false sense of superiority. The CEO returned with updates that the announcement had been made and that Brian, Vanessa, and Amber had been seen exchanging frantic looks with flight attendants while whispers spread among other passengers, and I felt no pity because I remembered every time Vanessa had rolled her eyes when I offered to join family outings, and every time Brian said next time, Mom, knowing there would never be a next time as long as his wife dictated the terms of my inclusion. I requested a full report of their flight itinerary and accommodations and authorized premium upgrades for every other passenger except the three of them because I wanted them to feel the sharp contrast between the generosity they had denied me and the privileges I extended to strangers who had done nothing to earn my trust or my wealth. The CEO offered to prepare a statement for the media in case the family attempted damage control upon their return, and I agreed, because I no longer intended to protect Brian from the consequences of allowing his wife to dictate how his mother should be treated while he stood silently complicit as I was erased from photos, conversations, and ultimately from the trip that had become my breaking point. For years I had believed my silence was strength and my sacrifices would eventually be repaid with love, but now I saw clearly that my silence had only emboldened them to push me further into the margins until I ceased to exist in their eyes except as a convenient cleaner, babysitter, and housekeeper. As the meeting concluded, I arranged to transfer management of my personal assets to a separate account inaccessible to Brian and instructed the CEO to prepare documents for a new apartment purchase because I had decided I would no longer live in a house where Vanessa's plants and laundry took precedence over my own comfort and dignity. When I left the building, I ignored another stream of missed calls and messages flashing on my phone screen because I understood any contact from them now was not about remorse or love, but about fear of losing control over a woman they thought was powerless and easy to discard without consequence. I returned to my house with the knowledge of my ownership fresh in my mind, and I walked through each room not as a servant checking Vanessa's list of chores, but as the rightful woman of the home they had turned into a workplace for me, because I finally understood that every corner I had cleaned, every meal I had cooked, and every errand I had run had been part of a system designed to keep me small, dependent, and grateful for crumbs of respect they never intended to give me. I placed my phone on the table without answering the calls coming in one after another from Brian and Vanessa because I refused to waste a single moment explaining myself to people who had spent years explaining away their dismissals of me with casual phrases like, "It's not personal," or "We thought you'd understand," while they arranged vacations, celebrations, and milestones I was never meant to attend. I pulled out Walter's documents again and reviewed the contact information for the legal team he had arranged for me, knowing I needed them to accelerate the transfer of all assets into accounts entirely separate from Brian's oversight because I remembered the time Vanessa suggested consolidating my small pension into their joint account for easier management, and I thanked her for the idea, believing her lies about efficiency, when in reality it had been about control. The lawyer confirmed the transfer process could begin immediately, and I signed the forms with a calm hand because I no longer feared what they would say or how they would retaliate, since I now understood their entire sense of power had depended on my willingness to accept their treatment as normal, when in fact it had been a slow erasure of my dignity under the pretense of family harmony. I instructed the legal team to prepare a notification for Brian and Vanessa that the house would be listed for sale within weeks because I refused to return from their trip and find myself taking orders in a space where I had once dreamed of seeing grandchildren's toys and family photos, only to discover that my presence was unwelcome unless I was performing tasks no one else wanted to do. The CEO of Company A sent a message confirming that Brian and Vanessa had received the captain's mid-flight announcement and that multiple passengers had recorded their shocked reactions on video, and I felt no need to watch the clips because I could already imagine Vanessa's frozen smile as she realized the woman she had sent home like a cleaning lady was the owner funding her luxury vacation. I instructed the hotel manager at their destination to arrange a special welcome message in their suite reminding them that every detail of their stay was courtesy of Company A, and I authorized premium experiences for all other guests except the three of them because I wanted them to feel the discomfort of watching strangers receive privileges they once believed were their entitlement. The manager confirmed the message had been delivered and that Brian had attempted to contact company staff directly to reverse the decision, only to be reminded that all directives now came from me, and I felt a deep satisfaction knowing my silence had been replaced with authority they could not undermine with apologies or excuses. I requested a comprehensive audit of all financial transfers and gifts I had provided over the years, including the down payment on their second car and the funds for their kitchen renovation, because I intended to send them an itemized summary of what I had given freely so they could understand the extent of my generosity before I severed every remaining obligation they thought they could exploit. As I organized these steps, I ignored another string of texts from Vanessa alternating between sugary apologies and veiled complaints about how my actions had caused embarrassment during their vacation, because I could see clearly now that her words were not about genuine regret, but about preserving her access to resources she had assumed were hers by default. I reviewed my account balances and instructed the legal team to freeze any automatic transfers that had been set up for household expenses, because I was no longer willing to fund a life where I had no seat at the table and no voice in decisions, yet carried the burden of cleaning up after their comfort and indulgence. I drafted a letter to Brian explaining in plain terms that my support over the years had been given out of love and not obligation, and that moving forward any relationship between us would have to be based on mutual respect and not the expectation that I would continue serving as their unpaid housekeeper and financial safety net while being excluded from even the most basic expressions of family. I scheduled a meeting with the foundation manager suggested by the CEO because I had decided to allocate a significant portion of my wealth to helping women like me who had been marginalized by their own families and convinced to accept lives of quiet servitude in exchange for false security and conditional affection. When I finally sat down to rest, I felt the weight of years lifting, because I had stopped waiting for Brian and Vanessa to call me mom with love in their voices and started calling myself by the name Walter had written on those documents, with a respect I had not felt since before marriage, motherhood, and decades of making myself small to fit into their expectations. The calls and messages from Brian and Vanessa escalated into a constant stream of desperate pleas and clumsy justifications as they sat in their luxury suite funded entirely by my company, unable to comprehend how the woman they had dismissed at the airport could possess the authority to upend their carefully crafted sense of superiority with a single announcement delivered by a captain who now treated me as the only voice that mattered. Brian's texts shifted from weak apologies to outright panic as he realized I had frozen the joint accounts he and Vanessa had been using for years to cover their overspending, and I scrolled through his words without replying because I no longer felt any obligation to soothe the man who once promised never to let me feel alone in my old age, yet allowed his wife to push me into silence and servitude. Vanessa sent long paragraphs alternating between flattery and guilt-tripping as she reminded me of the times she claimed to include me in their family gatherings while conveniently forgetting that I had been relegated to the kitchen to prepare food and clean up while her own mother sat beside her enjoying fine wine and warm conversations from which I was deliberately excluded. I instructed the hotel manager to deny Brian's request to upgrade their suite and instead offered those privileges to other guests staying in the same property because I wanted Brian and Vanessa to feel the sharp contrast between their diminishing access and the comfort of strangers whose only qualification was simply not betraying me. The CEO of Company A reported that Amber had attempted to complain to flight staff during their return leg about being seated away from Brian and Vanessa, but was reminded politely that all seating arrangements were at the discretion of the airline's owner, and I felt no need to interfere as I imagined the awkward silence settling over them when they realized the very airline they had chosen to flaunt on social media now belonged entirely to the woman they had erased. I reviewed the final draft of the financial report prepared for Brian, listing every payment, gift, and loan I had provided since Walter's death, and added a personal note clarifying that my future contributions would cease effective immediately because I refused to subsidize the lifestyles of people who saw me as useful only when I fulfilled their needs quietly in the background. The lawyer confirmed that the sale of my former house was progressing without issue, and I instructed him to notify Brian and Vanessa that they would need to vacate the property within 30 days because I no longer saw any reason to preserve a physical space that had become a symbol of my erasure in their lives. I arranged for my belongings to be packed and delivered to a temporary apartment secured by my legal team because I was unwilling to spend another night surrounded by the reminders of years spent cooking, cleaning, and sacrificing for people who never intended to honor even the most basic bond of family respect. The foundation's director sent me an initial proposal outlining programs designed to support women over 60 who had been financially manipulated or emotionally sidelined by relatives, and I approved immediate funding because I wanted my wealth to serve those who had suffered in silence like I once did, rather than enabling the entitlement of a son and daughter-in-law who believed kindness was a one-way obligation. As I signed the documents, finalizing my control over Company A's accounts, I received another voicemail from Brian asking me to consider his children's future before making rash decisions, and I felt no guilt because I remembered how those same children were taken on vacations without me, how I was never invited to school events or birthdays, yet expected to provide childcare on demand whenever Vanessa needed time for spa days or social gatherings. The CEO updated me that Vanessa had called the airline's customer service line multiple times trying to demand an explanation for the treatment they received on their vacation, but each time she was reminded that all operational decisions were approved by the company's owner, and I instructed him to continue denying her any special status because I wanted her to experience what it felt like to be powerless in a world where she was no longer able to dictate who deserved comfort and who did not. I finalized the purchase of a luxury apartment in the city center with a view of the skyline because I intended to begin my new life surrounded by spaces that reflected my worth rather than walls that had absorbed years of my unacknowledged labor and silent tears over being excluded from the very family I had built. When the lawyer confirmed the sale and the transfer of utilities, I authorized a formal letter to be sent to Brian informing him that the house he considered his fallback plan was no longer part of his future, and that he and his family would need to find their own way forward without the cushion of my sacrifices to shield them from their own mismanagement. As the final steps of my financial independence fell into place, I ignored yet another stream of frantic messages, this time from Amber asking if there was still time to resolve things, and I understood clearly now that none of them had ever intended to apologize or change, but only to secure continued access to resources they had come to view as their birthright. The moving company arrived early to pack what little I chose to take because I refused to carry objects tied to decades of quiet suffering, and I instructed them to leave behind anything Vanessa had labeled as hers, since she had once told her friends she was only letting me stay out of pity, which now felt laughable given that I had funded every major upgrade in the house she considered her accomplishment. I signed the final sale documents with a calm hand as my lawyer informed me the proceeds had been deposited into my personal account free from any access by Brian or Vanessa, and I authorized him to deliver the official eviction notice to their vacation resort because I wanted them to receive the news surrounded by strangers at the peak of their supposed triumph, where they could no longer pretend they had control over the narrative. The foundation director sent confirmation that the first group of women had been enrolled in programs to reclaim their financial independence and emotional dignity, and I felt a surge of resolve knowing my resources would now uplift those who had been treated as invisible servants in their own families instead of continuing to subsidize Brian and Vanessa's entitlement. I reviewed the final apartment purchase agreement and authorized immediate payment because I wanted to step into a space that reflected my rebirth, and I instructed my assistant to book an open-ended international itinerary for me because I refused to wait another year or month or week to live the life I had been denied by people who had conditioned me to think I was too old and too weak to deserve joy. Brian's messages grew increasingly frantic as he realized I was no longer responding with meek explanations or apologies for disrupting his comfort, and his tone shifted from pleading to accusatory as he reminded me of the money he claimed to have spent maintaining the house, even though every major expense had been funded by me while he and Vanessa took credit for my sacrifices. Vanessa's calls came in rapid succession with voicemails filled with performative remorse that dissolved into thinly veiled threats about family reputation and the children's stability, as if I had not already spent years being blamed for every inconvenience in their lives despite having provided free childcare, unpaid housekeeping, and financial support they treated as their right rather than a gift. I received a report from the CEO of Company A confirming that Brian had attempted to contact the board directly to question my decisions, but had been politely told that as the sole owner, I was under no obligation to consult anyone on operational matters, and I instructed the CEO to blacklist all requests from his number moving forward, because I no longer intended to entertain the illusion that Brian deserved a seat at any table of influence. I forwarded a letter to Brian's email summarizing every contribution I had made since Walter's death with exact figures, dates, and receipts to erase any doubt about the extent of my generosity, and I included a closing statement informing him that any future financial matters would be handled exclusively through legal channels because I would no longer allow family ties to be used as weapons against my independence. The apartment staff prepared my new home with every detail I requested, and I approved the delivery of a few personal belongings that held meaning for me before instructing the moving company to discard or donate the rest, because I refused to carry the weight of objects tied to years of being treated as a burden in a house I once believed would be my sanctuary. The travel coordinator confirmed my flights and accommodations across multiple continents, and I requested priority arrangements with the airline staff because I intended to experience every destination with the dignity and respect denied to me by the people who had once laughed at my dreams of traveling after Walter's death, claiming I was too frail to manage without their supervision. As I prepared to leave the country, I ignored another series of missed calls from Amber, whose tone had shifted to desperation as she attempted to distance herself from Brian and Vanessa's actions with claims of misunderstanding that I found insulting given her eager participation in the airport humiliation that became the catalyst for my transformation. When the driver arrived to take me to the airport, I gave one final instruction to my legal team to remove Brian and Vanessa as emergency contacts on all documents because I no longer trusted them to act in my best interests after years of using my vulnerability as leverage to maintain their comfort at the cost of my autonomy and self-respect. The private car pulled up as my assistant confirmed my international itinerary had been finalized with first-class arrangements secured on every leg of the journey because I had instructed her to spare no expense in ensuring my comfort after decades of watching Brian and Vanessa indulge themselves while I remained at home, tending their children, their pets, and their houseplants like an unpaid servant too timid to demand even a small space in their plans. The driver carried my luggage with professional courtesy as I received another update from my legal team confirming that Brian and Vanessa had been served the formal notice requiring them to vacate the house within 30 days, and I instructed them to proceed without delay because I no longer had any intention of setting foot in a space where I had spent years being spoken to as though my presence was an inconvenience and my labor an expectation. While boarding my flight, I received an encrypted message from the CEO of Company A reporting that Brian had attempted to arrange a meeting with key partners in an effort to undermine my authority, but every attempt had been blocked with a firm reminder that no business decisions could proceed without my explicit approval, which made it clear to him for the first time that he held no power over a company he had once assumed was merely a distant inheritance. The captain greeted me personally upon entering the cabin with the same deference Brian and Vanessa had enjoyed weeks earlier before their betrayal was exposed to every passenger on board, and I took my seat without a word because I had no need for performative gestures after spending my entire adult life performing gratitude for people who only remembered my existence when they needed favors. As the plane reached cruising altitude, I opened my phone to find dozens of messages from Brian ranging from apologies drenched in feigned remorse to demands for explanations he had no right to make given that he had stood silently at the airport as his wife smiled coldly and his friend took my seat with the ease of someone stepping over a discarded object. Vanessa's messages carried a tone of false humility as she claimed she had never intended for me to feel excluded, even though she had ordered me to water her plants and keep her house spotless for their return, as if I were a paid maid rather than the mother of the man whose respect she had successfully diminished with every passing year. Amber sent a single message expressing confusion about why I had targeted her with my revenge, as if she had forgotten her words at the gate when she thanked me for making her trip possible, and I remembered clearly how her condescension had cut through me harder than Vanessa's, because she was not even family, yet felt entitled to replace me without a second thought. The foundation director sent an update reporting that the first group of women had completed their financial literacy course, and several had already found new housing after years of being manipulated into believing they could not survive without the family members who had drained their pensions and dismissed their contributions with patronizing smiles that masked exploitation. The apartment manager confirmed that my new residence had been fully furnished to my specifications and would be ready for my return, and I instructed him to coordinate with my assistant because I intended to spend several months abroad discovering a world I had been told was beyond my capabilities while Brian and Vanessa scrambled to rebuild their lives without the financial safety net they had taken for granted for so long. I ignored another flood of calls from Brian marked urgent because I knew his urgency was not rooted in love or regret, but in fear of the consequences of having treated the woman who raised him as disposable once he realized she had held the keys to his entire lifestyle all along. When my meal arrived, I signed the credit slip with a hand that no longer trembled because I had finally severed the invisible leash Brian and Vanessa had kept around my neck by convincing me my worth was tied to their approval rather than my own decisions and desires. The foundation director forwarded a letter from a 72-year-old woman who thanked me for showing her that even after decades of neglect and manipulation it was possible to take back her life, and I felt a sharp clarity knowing that my revenge had already begun to transform into something greater than punishing those who betrayed me, because it was giving voice to women who had been silenced for generations. As the plane touched down at my first destination, I reviewed the finalized documents transferring full legal and financial autonomy to my name, and I instructed the legal team to send Brian a final notice informing him that all future communication regarding money would be handled by attorneys, because I no longer wished to engage in the emotional games that had once kept me trapped in cycles of hope and disappointment. I stepped into my new apartment weeks after my return from months abroad, having visited cities I had once only seen in magazines, while Brian and Vanessa continued sending emails filled with empty promises and pleas that I left unread because I no longer had interest in words from people who had taught me through years of dismissal that their concern only existed when their comfort was threatened. The foundation director updated me that over 100 women had already enrolled in the programs I funded, and several had written letters sharing how they walked out of homes where they were treated as unpaid caregivers and invisible burdens because they had finally seen proof in my story that dignity could be reclaimed no matter how late in life. Brian left multiple voicemails asking for a meeting to discuss family matters as if I had forgotten how he stood silently while Vanessa told me to go home and water her plants after stripping me of my place on a vacation I had prepared for with weeks of work and savings, and I deleted each message without replying because I no longer tolerated conversations where my role was to forgive and accommodate without accountability. Vanessa's tone shifted from sweet apologies to bitterness as she wrote that I was destroying their family legacy, and I felt no guilt because I remembered how she once suggested I move into their basement so they could renovate the main house for her parents while I was expected to remain grateful for scraps of space in a home I had funded with my life savings. Amber sent a final message insisting she had no part in my exclusion, even though I remembered her thanking me smugly at the gate for making her trip possible as I stood trembling with a suitcase full of clothes I had bought with my last money to avoid embarrassment in front of people who had never truly wanted me included. I instructed my lawyer to prepare a formal cease and desist letter barring Brian and Vanessa from contacting me directly because their repeated attempts at emotional manipulation had become nothing more than a desperate strategy to regain financial support now that the accounts they once accessed freely had been permanently severed. The CEO of Company A confirmed that the couple had been removed from any privileged status with the airline and that their requests for upgrades and complimentary services were now treated the same as any paying customer, and I approved without hesitation because I had no desire to enable people who had treated me like a maid in my own house. I finalized plans to expand the foundation internationally using a portion of the wealth Walter left me in secret because I wanted my resources to give other women the courage to stop waiting for gratitude from families who viewed them as disposable and start building lives where their worth was no longer tied to what they sacrificed for others. Brian's final attempt to regain control came in the form of a letter hand-delivered to my apartment door, but I left it unopened and instructed the building staff to refuse any future deliveries because I had decided I would no longer accept any communication that sought to rewrite the history of my erasure into a narrative of misunderstanding and regret. When the Foundation's first international center opened with my name on the plaque, I realized that my revenge had grown into something far larger than exposing my family's betrayal because it had become a movement restoring agency to women who had been taught to apologize for existing past the age where they could be useful to others. I met Brian for the last time in the lobby of my building because he had begged for weeks through lawyers to speak in person, and I agreed only to make it clear that my life no longer revolved around the man who had once promised as a child never to let his mother feel abandoned, yet grew into the adult who watched his wife humiliate me in public without raising a word of protest. He sat across from me clutching papers I refused to read because I knew they contained more empty assurances and shallow plans to restore what he called family harmony, even though I remembered with perfect clarity how he looked away at the airport as Vanessa told me I didn't belong on their trip and handed my seat to a friend who smirked at my tears. I told him with a steady voice that I was no longer the woman willing to overlook years of being spoken to like an employee in the house I built with Walter, or the countless holidays where I was excluded from photographs because Vanessa said my appearance would ruin the aesthetic she wanted for her social media. Brian tried to argue that his children missed me, and I reminded him they never knew me as anything other than the old woman who folded their laundry and served them meals during their parents' nights out because he and Vanessa never allowed me to be part of birthdays, school plays, or family vacations that were always reserved for her side of the family. He claimed Vanessa was deeply sorry for her words at the airport, but I reminded him of her years of condescension where she suggested I sell my jewelry to cover my medical expenses, even while she flaunted designer bags purchased with money I had quietly lent them under the illusion they respected my sacrifices. I stood as he pleaded for another chance, and I told him that forgiveness did not mean reinstating the access they once abused because I had learned too late that allowing people to repeatedly cross boundaries was not kindness, but a betrayal of my own worth. I instructed my assistant to escort him out as I left for my next meeting with the foundation board because I had no desire to sit through another performance of regret from a man who had spent years standing silently while others decided my value for me. The foundation director updated me that over 500 women across 3 countries had now enrolled in programs teaching them to reclaim their autonomy, and I approved plans to expand into 5 more regions because I intended to ensure that no other woman would spend decades believing her only role was to serve and be grateful for being tolerated. When Brian sent a final message saying he hoped I would one day remember the good times, I deleted it without hesitation because I no longer wished to carry memories clouded by the knowledge that behind every smile there had been quiet calculations about how much more they could take from me before discarding me again. I watched the city skyline from my office window and signed a new partnership agreement, knowing that for the first time in my adult life, every decision I made served my own growth rather than propping up people who had taken my silence as consent for their cruelty. I stood in my office reviewing the latest reports from the foundation as messages continued to arrive from women in every stage of reclaiming their lives because they had seen my story and realized they were not alone in their pain or their isolation after years of being used for their labor, their patience, and their silence by families who spoke of love yet showed only entitlement and exploitation when it came time to honor the sacrifices made on their behalf. I thought of the Frances who once stayed awake at night hoping for a phone call or an invitation from a son who had long stopped seeing her as a person and began viewing her as an unpaid servant whose only value lay in her ability to keep his house clean, his children fed, and his wife's plants watered. And I wished I could tell her sooner that there is no redemption in begging for scraps of attention from those who benefit from your invisibility. I watched the final transfer of funds complete as another property was secured for a new women's shelter, and I felt no sadness as I deleted Brian's last message asking if I could ever love him again, because I understood now that my love had been unconditional to a fault, and that unconditional love without respect is nothing more than a weapon to keep you small, compliant, and grateful for crumbs they never intended to share equally. I planned my next trip with the knowledge that every destination represented not an escape, but a declaration that life is not over when others decide you are no longer important, and that sometimes the most powerful revenge is not to make them suffer, but to make yourself whole in a world they can no longer touch or control.